It's been a few days since I last saw my dad, and only now have I gathered enough strength to share what happened. I don't have much clarity yet. My thoughts are still tangled, but I'll start with that day. Some of you were right, in ways I wish you hadn't been. While driving to my parents' house, an unexpected memory from my teenage years resurfaced, vivid and uninvited. I was 15 at the time, returning home from what had, up until then, been the worst day of my life. I had a boyfriend, my first, named Carlos. I'd had the biggest crush on him for as long as I could remember. When he finally asked me out, I was overjoyed. In my mind, I had already planned our future together. Wedding bells, a small house, kids running in the yard. I was naive. Carlos knew how much I adored him, and he used that knowledge to manipulate me. At first, he was sweet, charming, and everything a perfect boyfriend should be. But as time went on, he began pushing my boundaries. Slowly but surely, I gave in. By the time he got what he wanted, I was too blinded by my devotion to see the reality of who he was. The very next day, he broke up with me. To make matters worse, he told all his friends what had happened. I could feel their judgment in their stares and whispers as I passed by. In just one day, I went from being just another girl to that girl. When I got home, I rushed to my room and locked the door behind me. My parents must have sensed something was off because they knocked and called out to me, but I ignored them, blasting my music to drown them out. I knew I'd face consequences for it later, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to cry alone, to curl up in my bed and never leave. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, dusky light over the house, I finally left my room to go to the bathroom. My dad was standing there, right outside my door, waiting quietly. His arms were crossed, but his eyes, those eyes, betrayed the concern he felt. "I made you something to eat," he said softly. "Do you want it in the dining room or your room?" I couldn't face him at the table, so I chose my room. When I returned, the sandwich was already on my desk, a simple plate with a neatly arranged sandwich. Next to it was a small note, written in his unmistakable handwriting. 3 words, "I love you." I cried when I read it. The guilt of making him worry overwhelmed me, crashing over me like a wave. He didn't yell or demand answers. He simply stood there, offering his quiet support in the only way he knew. After eating the sandwich, I sat on my bed and tried to pull myself together. My tears dried, but the ache in my chest remained. I knew I couldn't keep hiding the truth. Whatever came next, his anger, his disappointment, I was ready to face it. He deserved the truth, no matter the cost. I called him into my room, my voice barely a whisper. He appeared almost immediately, his steps quiet, as if he didn't want to startle me. He sat beside me and asked, "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I clenched them together. My voice was tight, but I forced the words out. My eyes, red and swollen from crying, locked with his as I told him everything, every detail. When I finished, he looked at me in silence. That silence felt heavier than any words could have been. I braced myself for anger, for the disappointment I was sure would follow. But in his eyes, I saw something more complicated. Anger, yes, but not at me. It was a searing, molten fury directed at someone not in the room. Beneath that, sadness. Deep, endless sadness, like an ocean you could drown in. And something else, something I couldn't quite name. But it wasn't disappointment. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and before I could say anything, he wrapped me in his arms. The hug was silent, but full of love, so steady and strong that I couldn't stop my tears. I cried into his chest, and he held me tighter, as if trying to protect me from every hurt in the world. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered, his voice warm and steady. "You'll always be my special girl, Clara. Nothing will ever change that. Nothing." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. As the weight of everything began to settle, I asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if he could stay until I fell asleep. I didn't want to be alone yet. He didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said, pulling the chair from my desk closer to my bed. I woke up the next morning to find him still there, slumped in the chair, asleep. His hand rested on the edge of my bed, as if even in sleep, he couldn't bear to let go. Now, sitting in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the memory of my father asleep beside my bed replayed in my mind, like an old, comforting film. It was almost ironic, bitterly so, that now, after everything, I dreaded going into the house to see him. Before the tapes, I would have been ecstatic. I used to miss him terribly when he went away.
But now?
Now, just the thought of seeing him filled me with such dread that it almost made me drive away. But I couldn't. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin, and unlocked the front door. As it clicked open, I called out, "Hello," loud enough to be heard from anywhere in the house. My dad appeared almost immediately, emerging from the kitchen with his familiar gait. His face lit up when he saw me, and he closed the distance quickly, pulling me into a tight hug. His arms wrapped around me with all the affection I remembered, but I couldn't bring myself to hug him back. 3 months is too long, he said, kissing my cheek as he always did. I forced a smile, though it felt wrong, lopsided. Yeah, especially at your age, Dad. You should retire and stay with Mom. She gets lonely. My eyes flicked over his shoulder, searching for her, but the house was still. She didn't come out to greet me. Speaking of which, where's Mom? His face changed subtly, as if something heavy had settled on him. The joy drained away, replaced by something far more serious, something that made my stomach twist. I told her to keep herself busy today, he said, his voice now quieter. You and I need to talk. Alone? My heart sank. The weight of his words pressed on me, and suddenly I felt cold despite the warmth of the house. Okay, I said cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady. How should we do this? He led me to the living room, the same one where I had watched the woman in the woods video. Sitting there now, everything felt different. The air was thick with tension. We didn't speak for a few moments, but those moments stretched out like an eternity. I could feel the pressure building, sharp and unbearable, like the stillness before a storm. I watched his face shift, almost imperceptibly at first. The warmth I had always known in his expression faded, replaced by something colder, more authoritative. It was as though he were trying to find the right words, but the weight of whatever he needed to say filled the room, making everything harder to breathe. Finally, he spoke. His voice was cold, stripped of its usual warmth. Did you do as I told you? The tone hit me like a slap. It brought me back to my childhood, when his words alone were enough to make me shrink inside. My nerves flared, but I steadied myself. No, I replied, my voice calm despite the tightness in my chest. I didn't watch the rest of the videos, but I know what's on them. Military men torturing people. His face remained unreadable, but I saw the subtle tension in his shoulders as my words hit him. The silence that followed felt even thicker, heavier than before, filled with things we both avoided saying. I see. That was all he said. The words hung in the air, fragile and thin, as if they might shatter under the weight of the unspoken. I waited for a few seconds, my heart racing, before speaking again. Why did you guys have this? I asked, my voice shaking with anger and confusion. It's horrific. Why are tapes of torture, and... I hesitated, choking on the word. Murder, sitting alongside videos of my childhood. He sighed deeply, as if years had been pulled from his body. In that moment, I saw him not as my father, but as a man burdened with something too dark to carry alone. He looked older than I had ever seen him. I thought I got rid of those tapes, he confessed, his voice low, almost resigned. I never imagined your mother made copies. I thought I was prepared for anything, but hearing him admit it shattered me. The truth hit harder than I ever expected. He knew. He knew, and he tried to bury it. The silence that followed was suffocating. He sat across from me, stiff, his hands clenched on his knees. His posture was rigid, his jaw set as if he could turn himself to stone. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted around, searching for something, anything, to escape. I broke the silence. My voice, thin and shaky, wavered as I asked the question I was too scared to ask. What did you do? He sighed, deeply and heavily, as if the weight of decades rested on that one sound. Slowly, he rubbed his face, then met my gaze. But what I saw in his eyes wasn't guilt. It was defiance. I followed orders, he said flatly, as if reciting a report. Orders? My throat constricted. Orders to kidnap my parents? To erase them from existence. My voice cracked, trembling with a fury I could hardly contain. He flinched, but quickly his face hardened, as though the vulnerability had embarrassed him. Your father, he began, his voice tight, was a university professor. He taught literature. But he wasn't innocent. He hid 3 students wanted by the state. That made him a threat. I froze. He taught literature, I whispered, stunned. That's what made him dangerous? Reading books. His lips pressed into a thin line. He harbored fugitives, Clara. Guerrillas planning attacks. He knew exactly what he was doing. And you? I demanded, leaning forward, my voice rising. Did you know what you were doing? When you dragged them out of their home, when you watched them disappear, did you know what you were doing? His silence was damning, the refusal to break it more damning than anything. They were enemies of the state, he finally said, his voice brittle. It wasn't my decision. I was just following protocol. Protocol, I spat, the words sour in my mouth. Hiding behind that doesn't absolve you. You had a choice and you chose this. What was I supposed to do? His voice cracked, defensive, but not from regret. Refuse orders? End up like them? Do you think I had the luxury of moral outrage? Yes, I shouted, surprising even myself with the force of it. Yes, you were supposed to refuse. You were supposed to be human. For a moment his mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darted away. But then, with a stiffening of his back, he regained his composure. I did what I could, he said quietly. I made sure you were safe. Safe. The word burned like acid in my throat. You knew, I said, my voice trembling. From the beginning. You knew who I was, didn't you? His gaze faltered, but he didn't deny it. Yes, he said quietly, the word falling like a hammer. How? I asked, though part of me wished I didn't want to know. He hesitated, his hands clenching. Your mother, he finally said, his tone cold, was pregnant when we arrested her. The world tilted. My breath caught. Pregnant. My mother. The woman I had only ever seen as a shadow, a sob in the dark. That's how I knew who you were, he continued, voice almost emotionless. When they gave you to us, I recognized you immediately. You looked like her. A cold pit opened in my chest. And what happened to her? The words felt foreign, like someone else was asking them. She didn't make it, he said, his voice flat. Neither of them did. They were classified as subversives. It wasn't. Don't, I interrupted, my voice sharp and cracking. Don't you dare tell me it wasn't your decision. You were there. You watched them die. And then you brought me here and pretended you were some kind of savior. I gave you a life, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. A chance. Do you really think they could have given you that? They were criminals, Clara. They would have. Stop, I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. Just stop. You don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to take me and call it salvation. He flinched, as if my words had struck him, his face drained of color. For a moment, I thought he might break down, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. You raised me, I said, my voice trembling with both anger and something deeper, something I couldn't identify. You fed me, clothed me, tucked me into bed every night, while knowing you had stolen everything from me. How do you live with yourself? I thought I was doing the right thing, he whispered, his words barely audible. The right things, I repeated with a bitter laugh. For who? For me? For you? You think this is what they would have wanted for me? To be raised by the man who destroyed them. I just wanted to protect you, he said, his voice now lacking its earlier conviction. He seemed smaller, the weight of his sins finally bearing down on him. I wanted to give you the life they never could, I pushed my chair back with force, the screech of wood against tile slicing through the air. "You didn't give me a life," I said, my voice low, trembling with fury. "You took it. You stole me, and you stole them from me." He didn't try to stop me as I walked away. I didn't look back. The cold air hit me like a slap as soon as I stepped outside, sharp and biting. It felt real, more real than the man inside, more real than the lies he had spun around me for years. Leaning against the car, my body shook, tears streaming down my face. The truth weighed on me like a crushing burden, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stared at the sky, letting the cold numb me. I thought of my mother, terrified and pregnant, her life taken before she ever had the chance to hold me. I thought of my father, a man who had risked everything to protect his students, only to lose it all. Then I thought of him, my so-called father, sitting in that room, his hands clean in his own mind, even as the blood stained them. I didn't just lose my parents. He erased them. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city for hours, letting the hum of the radio and the passing streetlights distract me from the chaos in my mind. The streets were my refuge, the motion keeping the thoughts at bay. But every time a red light forced me to stop, reality crept back in, sharp and relentless. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, my nails digging into the leather, the pain grounding me just enough to hold back the tears threatening to spill. Eventually, hunger caught up with me, and I stopped at a gas station. Sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, I ate a burger that tasted like cardboard, more out of necessity than desire. My thoughts churned, a relentless storm, but then one idea surfaced, a dark, terrifying thought. It made my stomach twist, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It felt like the only option left, the final piece of this unbearable puzzle. With trembling fingers, I texted Lucas, telling him I'd be staying with my sister. The lie felt hollow as I typed it, but it was easier than explaining. Without hesitation, I turned off my phone, letting the screen go dark, as if that could silence the world for a while. The first hotel I found became my refuge. I walked into the lobby and forced a smile at the receptionist, every muscle in my face straining against the weight of my emotions. Checking in felt like a surreal performance, a play I didn't want to act in. But somehow, I made it through. The fake smile still plastered on my face as I took the key and climbed the stairs to a room that promised no comfort, only solitude. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the laptop. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap polyester blanket tangled around my legs. The key to the pen drive felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried all the weight of the truth I was about to uncover. I stared at the laptop screen, my thumb hovering over the touchpad. A part of me wanted to leave it closed, to walk away and let the nightmare end. But the curiosity, the need, was too strong. If I didn't watch, I would never move on. And I needed to know. The first video loaded slowly, the spinning icon on the screen matching the frantic beat of my heart. When it began, the camera was shaky, focusing only on the dirt floor of a dimly lit room. Then the voices started. At first, they were muffled, unintelligible. Then the camera shifted and I saw them. Two men, their heads hooded, their hands bound behind their backs, kneeling on the ground. A third man paced in front of them, his boots crunching on the dirt. His voice was calm, methodical, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. "Names," he said. "Give me the names." The camera moved again, and the interrogator's face came into view. My stomach dropped. It was him, my so-called father, younger but unmistakable. His expression was cold, detached, the face of someone who had done this countless times and would do it again. My hands gripped the laptop as the scene played out. One of the hooded men groaned, his voice hoarse. "I don't know anything," he whispered, barely audible. The sound that followed made my blood run cold, a sharp, wet crack as the interrogator's fist struck the man's jaw. The groan turned into a muffled cry, and blood dripped onto the ground beneath him. "Stop lying," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "You're only making this harder on yourself." The The camera shifted to the second figure, who trembled but said nothing. Something in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched, the protective angle of his body, made my breath catch. It was him. My father. My real father. A wave of nausea washed over me, my vision blurred. I wanted to close the laptop, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the image on the screen. My fake father stepped toward him, his shadow falling over the man. "And you," he said. "You're the one who hid them, aren't you? You thought you could outsmart us." The man lifted his head slightly, his face obscured by the hood, but I could feel his defiance. He didn't speak, but his silence was an answer in itself. "Fine," said my tormentor, his voice eerily calm. "If you won't talk, we'll try another method." The camera shifted again, and suddenly there she was, my mother. She was seated in a chair, her hands bound behind her back, her face pale but resolute. Her stomach, swollen and unmistakable, told me everything. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She was pregnant. Pregnant with me. The man who raised me crouched in front of her, his expression softening in a way that made my stomach turn. "We don't have to do this," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Tell us what we need to know, and you can go home. You and your child." She stared at him, a mix of terror and fury on her face. "You'll kill us anyway," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't respond, just nodded to someone off-screen. The screen blurred as the camera moved again, and the next sound was one I would never forget. A scream. My mother's scream. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My hands trembled violently, my vision swimming with tears. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely reaching the sink before the bile rose in my throat. I retched until nothing was left, my body shaking with the force of it. When I finally straightened, gripping the sink for support, I saw myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I didn't recognize the person staring back. I sank to the floor, my knees pressing into the cold tile. The truth was unbearable, overwhelming. He knew. He had known all along. And he had done this. The screams from the video echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that would never leave me. They weren't just my parents. They were his victims. Several days have passed since I began writing this, but the memory of that video still haunts me. My mother's scream, raw and piercing, lingers in my mind, the only fragment of her voice I will ever hear. It fills the silence, reminding me of everything I've lost without ever knowing. I don't know what to do. When I first watched those old tapes, I thought it would be a nostalgic glance into the past. I never imagined it would shatter my world. My life had seemed perfect, blissfully normal, but in just a few days, that illusion crumbled. I uncovered the truth about my parents, and, in the process, lost what I thought was my family. But was it ever truly a family, built on lies? The most heartbreaking part is that I have no idea how to honor my real parents. They are little more than ghosts to me, shadows in the dark. All I have is a single photograph of my mother and those grainy, terrible videos. I don't know their names, their stories. The people who could help me are all gone. I've spent hours scouring the internet, looking through lists and archives of the disappeared. There are so many faces, so many names, but none that match the memories I wish I had. It's overwhelming, like trying to find a single star in a galaxy. Professor Garcia suggested I reach out to organizations that specialize in these cases, people who could help trace my parents' identities. But the thought terrifies me. What if I learn more than I can bear? What if the truth is worse than what I already know? This happened so long ago, yet its shadow stretches into my life now, into the present. Most of those responsible have been punished or are already dead, their crimes buried with them. But not that man. He still walks free. He lived a full life, built a family, raised me. And somehow, he used me, my very existence, as a shield against his crimes. That thought fills me with a cold, paralyzing dread. There are nights when I wonder if I'll ever feel whole again. If I'll ever know who I truly am. My real parents are strangers to me, yet they are the foundation of everything I'm searching for. How do I mourn people I never knew? How do I carry their legacy, their suffering, when all I have are fragments, just questions and echoes?
I'm sorry, Mom.
I'm sorry, Dad. I hope one day I'll be brave enough to find you. I hope I'll learn your names, your faces, your stories. And I hope that wherever you are, you'll know that I am trying. Trying to remember you. Trying to honor you. Trying to be the person you might have wanted me to be. When I returned to my hometown, I thought I had finally left the worst of my bad luck behind me. I had already lost my job, my marriage, and most of my savings, enough for 1 year, I thought. The slower pace of life in the Midwest, surrounded by endless fields and quiet roads, felt like just what I needed. But I didn't realize that some things are better left undisturbed, and Briar's Bend was one of those things. The road didn't seem like much at first, a narrow, winding strip of asphalt cutting through the dense woods just outside of town. It was the kind of shortcut you'd take to save 10 minutes on a long trip if you weren't paying close attention. It didn't have streetlights, only the occasional reflective sign blinking in the dark. I first heard about Briar's Bend from Hank Sullivan, my neighbor. Hank was the kind of guy who could talk for hours about nothing, always ready to share stories about the town. One evening, after I had mostly unpacked, Hank leaned over the fence with a beer in hand and a conspiratorial grin on his face. "You ever hear of Briar's Bend, Caleb?" he asked, clearly eager to share something. I hadn't, but I humored him. "Should I have?" "It's got a reputation," he said, his grin fading. "People say it's cursed. Drivers lose control for no reason, even on clear nights. Some folks call it bad luck. Others," he paused, glancing around as if the trees might be eavesdropping, "they say it's the hairy hands." I laughed, but Hank didn't join in. "The hairy hands?" "Disembodied hands," he said, lowering his voice. "They just appear out of nowhere and grab the wheel, or the handlebars if you're on a bike. They force you off the road. Legend has it they even caused horse-drawn carriages to crash, back in the day." "And people believe this?" I asked, incredulously. "They do. Enough so that most won't take that road after dark. You shouldn't either." I rolled my eyes but thanked him for the warning. Hank had grown up here, so I figured he was just repeating one of those small-town campfire tales. I didn't believe in curses or ghost stories, especially not ones about phantom hands. That changed a few weeks later. It was a Wednesday night, and I'd gone to visit a friend in the next town. The drive back was supposed to be easy, but I left later than expected, and the interstate was closed for construction. My GPS, smug and indifferent, rerouted me down Briar's Bend. The name didn't register until I was already on it. The road was darker than I expected. My headlights illuminated the asphalt ahead, but the trees on both sides crowded in so tightly they felt like walls. The night was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I approached a curve, one of those sharp turns that required caution. That's when it happened. The wheel jerked hard to the right, as if someone had yanked it out of my hands. I shouted, instinctively pulling back, but the force was overwhelming. My knuckles went white as I struggled to keep the car on track, the tires skidding against loose gravel. The sensation was impossible to describe. There was nothing visible, no hands, no figure, but I could feel it. A forceful, bone-deep pressure on my hands, as though someone's fingers were gripping mine, making me turn. I managed to wrestle the wheel back just in time to avoid crashing into the guardrail. The car screeched to a stop, and I sat there, panting, trying not to hyperventilate. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the steering column had locked up, or the road was slicker than I'd thought. But none of that explained the feeling, the unmistakable sensation of something stronger than me trying to take over. I stepped out of the car, shaky legs holding me up, and looked around. The woods were still, the road empty. There was no sign of another driver, no explanation for what had just happened. My hands trembled as I ran them over the steering wheel, hoping to find something, anything, that made sense of the experience. But there was nothing, just the faint impression of pressure lingering on my skin. I got back in the car and drove home, keeping my speed low. The whole time, I couldn't stop glancing at the wheel, half expecting it to jerk again. When I pulled into my driveway, Hank was sitting on his porch with another beer in hand. He waved, grinning lazily. I thought about telling him what happened, but stopped myself. What would I even say? That the hairy hands nearly killed me? Instead, I gave him a nod and went inside, locking the door behind me. Ito must have caught wind of how badly the headhunting assignment had gone. He found a moment between tasks to meet up with me. Most of the time, our meetings took place at hotels, though occasionally we had a few park dates. I started to think that whatever we had was becoming a bit more serious than he might have wanted to admit. As long as I kept that thought to myself, I figured things would stay the same. One day, a park date was interrupted by a gremlin of a creature I regretted taking on. "I have a job for you, human," April shouted, hands planted firmly on her hips. She did this right in the middle of a busy path. I rolled my eyes, doing my best to ignore the curious stares from passers-by. I was planning to leave soon. "Go ahead. Call me if you need help or if something comes up," Ito offered. I squeezed his hand before he left, wishing I had the confidence to kiss him in public. April waited until he was out of sight before she started briefing me. She'd been assigned to investigate a ghost town that had been hit by some strange weather. She made it clear she didn't want to take on the task, but the black collar forced her to go at least check the place out. She proposed sticking with me until the collar let her go, and I could handle the rest. She offered to pay me half of what she earned for the job. I had nothing else planned, and half was better than nothing. I agreed. We used a key to open a public washroom door and were transported to the abandoned town in the middle of the desert. Those magical doorways came in handy. The entire corporation might not even function without them. I had my own key that could connect me directly to the office, but it was a one-time use, and they deducted the cost of getting a new one from my pay. I'd learned to be frugal over the years of working this job. "Are you dating that agent?" April asked, not even bothering to look my way. She kicked at a rotting board in the middle of the road, standing ankle-deep in mud after the recent rain. "Sorta," I replied. She found a large black beetle scurrying away after she disturbed its hiding spot. I watched as she bent down, grabbed it, and tossed it into her mouth. The sound of crunching made my skin crawl. She didn't speak for a while. I could tell she didn't have the best relationship with the corporation, especially considering she'd been forced to work for them. "Sorta isn't a good answer. It should be a yes," she finally said. "Sorta is all you get with agents. They don't like to date because of their job." I shrugged. She frowned, and I could feel her judging me. She stood up and kicked my shin, leaving a mud stain. "I don't like people who do things halfway." "It's either a yes or a no," she said stubbornly. Was I doing things halfway with Ito? This kind of relationship was a safeguard for both of us. Ito wasn't the only one putting his life at risk every time he worked. I had been lucky lately staying alive. I wanted him to be able to move on easily when my luck eventually ran out. April interrupted my thoughts when she started digging in the mud. A huge storm had recently passed through, scattering parts of an old wooden building along the road. I noticed shards of glass and trash mixed into the dirt. I knew she healed quickly, but I didn't want her hurting herself. "April, sweetie, play in some cleaner mud," I suggested. She raised an eyebrow, not quite understanding. I pointed to a puddle where she could splash around while I explored the area. The town wasn't large. I counted 9.5 buildings along the road. A sign had been erected for visitors to read about the history, but there was no gift shop or anyone around. I'd never heard of this ghost town before, and it was nowhere near another city. The buildings were left to decay, visited only by a handful of people each year. The land wasn't valuable, so no one bothered to tear down the deteriorating town. A place like this was perfect for creatures to call home, away from prying eyes, with the occasional victim wandering into their territory. If someone died out here, it would be easy to claim they got lost and perished from exposure. Suddenly, April hugged me from behind, causing wet mud to seep into my clothes. At least I needed to do laundry that night. "This place is boring," she complained. "I don't know. I think it's interesting." According to this, the town was flooded by a freak storm and abandoned 100 years ago. Isn't it impressive that the buildings have lasted this long? Her face showed no sign of being impressed. April could have been as old as the town. 100 years was nothing to some creatures. I realized I didn't know much about her. I wasn't even sure what kind of creature she was. There were so many different species out there, it was hard to keep track. Most didn't have names that humans could pronounce, and it was considered rude to ask. You never asked a woman her age, and you never asked a supernatural being what they were. Do you have any clues about why we were called here to investigate? I asked, trying to steer us back on track. She shook her head, distracted by some tasty bugs. What did the email say? I pressed. I don't know. I just skimmed it. You know, the usual stuff. A few people turning up dead and all that. She responded unhelpfully. A few? How many was a few? And how did they die? Didn't she mention weird weather, and now we were dealing with deaths? April noticed my crossed arms and rolled her eyes. Some witnesses said they left when they saw a storm coming, even though it rarely rains here. Their friends stayed behind and were found dead with water in their lungs. But the area around the bodies was bone dry. Nothing too interesting, she added dismissively. Yes, when you worked with supernatural creatures, 2 people drowning in a desert wasn't that exciting. Unlike April, who only cared about her next snack or a good fight, I wanted to understand what had happened here. We didn't have many leads, except that it had clearly rained here recently. I closed my eyes, then opened my left eye to take a better look at the area. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. April watched me, intrigued by my strange actions. I noticed her magic flowing in a healthy pattern. The color looked familiar. I wanted a place where I had seen something like it before, but I needed to stay focused on solving the mystery at hand. Magic left traces behind. If the storm had been caused by a spell, there should be some signs of it. I tried to make sense of what I saw for a moment. There were bright, thin lines swirling through the ground beneath us. I crouched low, trying to feel the power in the air. Magic leaks from living beings and accumulates in places, forming a certain flow. Being in a desert, the flow should have been much weaker than what I was seeing. It looked like a spiderweb of magic. The glowing threads were so intense, they hurt my eyes, so I shook my head to clear my vision. Does this place feel different to you? I asked April, but she didn't seem to understand what I was getting at. April had never been in a place devoid of magic. Due to her work, she usually only visited places teeming with it. We didn't have much time to ponder the question. The wind picked up, carrying an unnatural chill. My skin prickled, my body sensing something drawing near. April got to her feet, claws ready for whatever threat was coming. Her sundress flapped in the fierce wind. Thunder crashed overhead so loudly that I had to cover my ears. The sky turned gray, and heavy raindrops began to pelt the ground. April moved to protect me from an approaching threat. Looking up, I saw a figure stumbling out from behind one of the wooden buildings. It had once been human. Its dried-out body clung to its bones, and its sunken, dark eyes locked onto us. Fear struck my heart. I had faced many monsters, but this one terrified me. My feet were frozen to the ground as the wind howled, trying to carry us away. The rain hit the walking corpse. The water was absorbed into its dried skin. I didn't need to see clearly to know that this body was carrying a load of magic, enough to create the storm above us. April charged forward, ready to fight, but her feet slipped in the mud, and the storm made it impossible for her to stay standing. The wind knocked the breath out of me. I raised my arms over my face, trying to shield myself. The rain was so large it stung when it hit me. I couldn't get enough air, choking as I inhaled rainwater. A terrifying thought crossed my mind. I might drown right here in this storm. I needed a plan fast. With great effort, I forced my eyes open and followed the trail of magic, hoping to find something useful. To my shock, all the glowing threads led straight to the corpse. What was this thing? Had someone created it? Or was it just a person who refused to die? There were too many strands for me to handle on my own. I wasn't sure if April could sever them either. Even if she could, we didn't have time. Within moments, I was choking, gasping for breath. An arm wrapped around my waist, and I was dragged away. Everything went black for a moment. When I came to, April was pressing hard on my chest, trying to get me to cough up the water in my lungs. I rolled over and vomited what felt like a gallon of water onto the dirt floor. When I recovered, I looked around. April had dragged us into the old jailhouse cell and closed the bars behind us. Smart move. Iron dulled magic and helped neutralize supernatural senses. The storm still raged outside, but for now, we were safe to catch our breath and plan our next move. April sat against the far wall, hugging her knees to her chest and wringing out water from her dress. She looked like a drowned rat. I didn't look much better. "What is that thing?" she asked quietly. "Death," I answered after a long pause. She frowned at my dramatic response, but it was the truth. That thing outside was nothing but death itself, seeking to end life in the same way it had been ended. I lost myself in thought, trying to figure out what we were up against and how to defeat it. I was terrified, not just for myself, but for April too. Her strength was in ripping and tearing, but she couldn't even get close to this enemy. I began drawing lines in the dirt, mulling over my theory. "I think there's a ley line nearby," I muttered. "A what?" April asked. I looked up, confused that she didn't know what I meant. "All creatures should be aware of the magic veins running through the earth. Magic rivers," I clarified.
"Oh."
"We call them." She made clicking and chirping noises that reminded me of a grasshopper. It made sense that her species had a different name for ley lines. There was no universal term for them between all creatures, and I never liked calling them that myself. Right, one of those. I think the corpse outside was a person who died in the flood that destroyed the town 100 years ago. Their body must have been swept away and never recovered. They were either a supernatural being or a human with strong magic control. Over time, the body absorbed magic and eventually became what we saw. I explained, feeling more confident in my theory. "If it's near a ley line, then why wait until now?" April asked. "If it's drawing power from the magic, it's got nearly unlimited access." I nodded, agreeing with her. The amount of magic we were dealing with was terrifying. If it was really feeding from a ley line, there was no one strong enough to handle that kind of power. Ley lines shift and move over time. It must have been slowly absorbing magic, and then the flow shifted closer to it. April looked surprised by that information. She had grown up in a forest, or an area where the ley lines didn't shift, or were large enough to cover the area even if they did. "We need to leave. You have an office key, right? Use the door, and let's get out of here." Her words took me by surprise. I never thought she would suggest running from a fight. Our enemy was far too much for us to handle. Leaving was the smart option, and that was rare for April. You can't create a doorway through iron. Besides, if this is an undead creature, I can listen to its soul. If we can understand the grudge it carries, we might be able to. She suddenly stood up and stomped her foot, looking almost childlike.
"No.
You're human. That's too much for you. Draw a damn door, and let's get out of here." She half shouted, her face flushed pink with frustration. I shook my head, trying to calm her down. Supernatural creatures have trouble dealing with the dead, right? I'm better suited for this because I'm human. The agents who deal with the dead are swamped with other tasks. They won't be here anytime soon. She was even more upset by my response and sat back down, grumbling. "No one ever listens to me or cares about my feelings," she muttered. Where had that come from? The storm outside grew louder. If we wanted to use the door, it was best to wait until the monster calmed down. If it sensed the door and attacked before we both got through, I didn't want to think about the consequences. "Let's stay here for a while and think this through," I suggested. She nodded, curling up into herself, resting her chin on her knees. If there wasn't an undead creature waiting to kill us, the sound of the storm outside might have been relaxing. I wasn't sure how much time passed. I thought about calling for help, but my phone wouldn't work in the magical storm, or maybe it had just gotten too wet. "Do you know the story of the original Silver King?" April asked in a voice that seemed out of place for her. "There are many versions. Which one do you know?" I asked, curious. I sat next to her, half expecting her to shove me away. She refused to look in my direction, but she didn't move either. I heard that in the first world, he created all the supernatural creatures. They were beasts, mercilessly killing and devouring humans. But then the original king fell in love with a human. He wanted his creations to experience the same feeling, so he made it possible for us to love. He did this before the human he cared about died, and it tore him apart. It hurt him. A lot. Everyone suffered because they could now love, and his creations turned on him, furious at these new emotions. They killed him, but a trace of him still lingers, commanding us. It was similar to the story I had heard. This must have been a bedtime tale April had heard countless times before. But why bring it up now? Don't you think that was cruel of him? Don't you think we'd be better off as monsters who couldn't love? She said, her voice carrying an odd heaviness as she glanced my way. I agreed that a lot of pain had come from supernatural creatures being able to love humans. There were days when I wasn't sure if it was all worth it. But her words triggered something in me. I found myself studying her, taking in her features, her dark, slightly wavy hair, her dark eyes, and her jawline. I had seen them all before, on someone else. Do you have an older brother named August? I asked, surprised I hadn't realized it sooner. Her face flushed with anger, and she looked away again. My family died a long time ago. That confirmed it. He must have done something to her that led April to sever ties with her only family. How had I not connected the dots earlier? They had the same collars, the same handler, and even similar names. I'll let him know you're doing all right. He adopted a sweet human child. Would you like to see pictures when my phone works again? Her eyes flickered back and forth, clearly trying not to show any interest. No matter what August had done in the past, she probably wanted to meet her new adopted nephew. I don't have any family. I don't know what you're talking about, but I do like cute pictures. That felt like a step toward reconciliation. But we had to focus on surviving. The storm outside had lessened. Soon it wouldn't matter. I stood up and offered my hand to April. I have a plan. Do you trust me? I asked. She bit her lip. To her, I was just a weak human. I'd probably done something awful by forcing us to become friends.
She cared about me, though.
Aside from Evie, I might be her only friend. I should have just stayed a coworker, but I couldn't help feeling grateful for the bond we had formed, even if it cost me my life. She reached up and took my hand, getting to her feet. I asked her to perform a small task that I hoped would help us escape alive. We stepped outside again, still terrified of what lay ahead, but at least we felt like we could face it together. The corpse was waiting for us. The storm hit harder than before, and the building's boards were being torn off by the fierce winds. This time, I knew to hold my breath. The rainwater stung my eyes, making it nearly impossible to see. I shut them tight, relying on my senses to detect the massive magic before us. April gripped my waist and pushed against the storm with all her strength, dragging us within reach of the corpse. It screamed, a bone-chilling sound that nearly made me collapse. My arm shot out, and I seized the creature, shuddering at the dry, unnatural texture of its flesh. I wanted to connect with its soul, hear its regrets, and offer peace. But that wasn't possible. Whatever soul it might have had was replaced by a sea of hatred so deep I couldn't fathom it. Pain and fear consumed me as I faced an embodiment of death. This was no longer a person, and nothing we did would stop its rage. I gasped, lungs burning from holding my breath. The winds weren't as strong near the corpse. I felt a surge of magic building, the undead creature preparing to blow us away. We had mere seconds to act. April got behind it and expertly cut a large square in its dried flesh. The creature hissed, but the wound could easily heal. I just needed it to last 3 seconds. She yanked me around, and I thrust my hand forward to insert a key into the new wound. The key linked 2 doorways. However, there were places in the world without nearby doors, so by drawing a rectangle and inserting the key, it would create a new door. It just took more magic, and fortunately, we had access to plenty of it. I pulled on the magic the undead creature was channeling and forced it into the key. My body burned with the power, and I thought I might be torn apart by the energy. I gritted my teeth, refusing to give in. I didn't have full control over the magic, but I poured it into the key and opened a rip, revealing the corporation office beyond. I couldn't move, so April hauled me through the tear. We crashed to the ground, rolling to a stop. The unstable connection behind us flickered and then exploded. We were struck by flying chunks of drywall and a doorframe. I had no idea what had happened on the other side, whether the undead creature was still intact, but it might be able to heal from being blown apart. Maybe. I didn't sit up for a long time. My ears rang, and my body ached. I needed a new career. Finally, I rose, my vision swimming with colors I didn't think humans should be able to see. We faced a wall that had been blown apart, and beyond it was an office space. Desks were covered in drywall dust, and a few stunned workers stared at us, unsure how to react. Magic doors were stable spells, but no one had ever seen one backfire like this. We were lucky the damage was minimal. Footsteps echoed through the office, and a familiar face appeared. Care to explain what just happened? Klaus asked, forcing a strained smile as he inhaled sharply. We found ourselves sitting across from Klaus. For the first time, I felt scared of him. April was given a towel and a popsicle, but I refused anything to eat or drink. The thought of food made me feel nauseous. You opened a door on a creature's back. Klaus asked again. I nodded, regretting it. That's brutal. I've never heard of anyone doing that. Since you admitted it was your idea, April's in the clear. But let me remind you, protocol is to never open a doorway while fighting a creature. If there's no other choice, use a key connected to an empty office for that purpose, not the main office. It's to keep our workers safe. Since this is your first offense, I'll let it slide with a warning. I nodded again, guilt gnawing at me. I had risked the lives of office workers just to save April and myself. They could have fired us both, and that would have been disastrous for April. She'd been forced to work by a collar, with few choices in her life, and the corporation might have had no reason to keep her around. We were dismissed and began to leave the room when Klaus suddenly wrapped us in a hug. I'm glad you two made it back, he said, and I felt my face turn red. I didn't pull away out of embarrassment. Klaus had been doing this job for a long time, and I'm sure he'd seen plenty of people sent out into the field without returning. This better be a friendly hug, because this loser's taken, April remarked. I didn't think Klaus saw me in that way. We were just coworkers, happy to see each other alive after a dangerous day. We were released to go home. April proudly announced she was going to spend the rest of the day eating pizza pockets and napping. She had earned it. The storm still raged over the town, tearing it apart bit by bit. It would be a long time before the magic ran out, and the area would be safe enough to enter again. So, the town was sealed off, hidden from human eyes. That night, I called Ito. He was working and couldn't meet, but that was fine. I just wanted to talk. He hadn't heard about the events at the ghost town yet, and if he had, I would have gotten an earful. We spoke about nothing important, and I needed that simple conversation. I wondered if it was time to stop doing things halfway. I might have been ready to face the pain a relationship would bring, but I wouldn't force that on him. Right then, I was just happy he picked up the phone. Before you pass judgment, hear my entire story. I, 35M, was married to Lena, 34F, for 10 years. If you had told me back then that one day I would sleep with her older sister, Riley, 40F, and eventually marry her, I would have laughed. Yet here we are. Let me explain. The nightmare began with Lena's death from pancreatic cancer. She will always be my true wife. Then, 2 weekends ago, the second wave of grief hit me, starting with a single question. Was she telling the truth? About what? Riley asked. I stood in the front room of Macy Manor, watching the snow fall outside, watching white swallow black. Meanwhile, Riley sat in her father's old armchair, by the crackling fire, holding a tumbler of brandy in her fingers, lost in thought, much like me. When Mr. and Mrs. Macy passed away in 2005, Riley inherited the grand Edwardian house and became Lena's guardian. That's when Lena, my childhood friend, finally admitted the truth. Lena told me that you and she could see her parents' spirits, I said, breaking the silence. Riley stared vacantly at the opposite side of the room, and I followed her gaze. My eyes landed on an empty armchair, a shadow draped across it. The dancing flames from the fireplace cast strange patches of darkness throughout the room. After a long pause, Riley whispered, "A century ago, Ernest Macy built this house over a dark hole in the ground. In his journal, he warned that no one in the family should ever enter it. It took a terrible toll on him. But that toll gave the Macy family the ability to see the spirits of our loved ones." She paused, then added, "Let's face it, this gift dies with me. I'm the last of the Macy line, and I won't have children." "Lena never mentioned any mystical hole in the earth," I replied, trying to suppress a laugh. "Because you always wear that ridiculous grin, Artie," Riley said with a smirk, tapping her foot against an old, dusty leather-bound book on the coffee table. "This is Ernest's diary. I think that book's been there since I first came to your house," I said, nodding. "But Riley, I've always respected your family's beliefs. Still, I've never seen any proof of ghosts here." "Well, you're not a Macy," she said simply. I nodded, my hand subconsciously brushing against the outline of Lena's engagement ring in my pocket. "No, not exactly." Riley continued staring at the vacant armchair, the shadows still looming over it. Then, coldly, she said, "Lena wants to show you in the best way she can that she's still here." Without thinking, I blurted, "I want to believe." "Lena, if you hear me." Before I could finish, the empty armchair flipped upside down, violently crashing against the ceiling. I screamed, of course, any sane person would. My body tensed, muscles straining, but the chair fell, crashing to the floor with a cloud of dust. After a long silence, I whispered, "I've felt her presence here since she passed." "The dead never really leave this place," Riley said softly. "Grief is different for Macy. Even for you, Artie. You're like family." "What if I had been a Macy?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What if I'd married Lena and taken her name?" Riley nodded. "My mother married into the family, and she saw the faces of the dead. Then, without a pause, I asked something terrible. We should marry. You and me. That way, I could see her too." I expected laughter, or some kind of protest. But Riley, to my surprise, seemed to understand. Perhaps the thought had already crossed her mind. "Let's not go there, Artie," she said, her voice serious. I turned back to the overturned armchair, speaking to the shadow I knew was Lena's. "Lena, it would only be a marriage on paper." "I'm not saying no on her behalf," Riley explained. "But you'd need to do more than just change your surname. We'd have to consummate the marriage, Artie." "Oh," I said, my voice small, followed by a creaking sound from the chair. Riley laughed. "Oh, if only you could see the look your wife is giving you." After that, I grew silent, and Riley went to bed. I spent the rest of the night skimming through Ernest's diary. Lena was reading alongside me, and I could feel her excitement, matching mine, as we came across the section titled "The Plea of Two." A gust of wind flipped one of the old pages, ripping it from its place, revealing a passage that read, "To return a loved one's physical form, the ritual must be performed by two living members of the Macy family." The weight of it hung in the air, and I could feel Lena's desire to return. Had she not wanted that second chance, I wouldn't have gone through with it. I wouldn't have woken Riley at 4 in the morning to explain everything. She fought with Lena over the morality of it all, not just marrying and sleeping with her late sister's husband, but bringing the dead back. Lena and I should have listened, but we didn't. After 10 minutes of arguing, Riley succumbed to the pull of ending our grief. "If we don't try, I'll regret it forever." I stared at her, jaw hanging. "Does that mean—" "Vegas is the fastest option," Riley interrupted. "We'll consummate the marriage quickly. No lights. No talking." I nodded, sobbing with joy, my eyes flicking toward the shadowy corner where Lena hid. A few days later, Riley and I flew to Vegas. We signed the papers. We did the deed. It lasted less than 10 seconds, a shameful moment in an unlit hotel room, followed by a silent flight back to England. A week later, we returned to Macy Manor. The night darker and snowier than before, We stepped inside. All discomfort melted away when I saw her. Lena, blonde, in her unmistakable blue dungarees. She was a glowing specter at the top of the staircase. We ran to each other, sobbing and declaring our love, and those tears only grew heavier as we tried to embrace, realizing that we couldn't touch. I reminded myself why Riley and I had done this, why we had tried to bring Lena back. Lena's ghost stood in the front room doorway, and Riley and I, hand in hand, recited Ernest's words. We begged the dark thing from the basement to return Lena. I wondered if Ernest had really obeyed his own rule, or if someone else had gone down there over the years. I was jolted from my thoughts as the diary slammed shut, rattling the house. Riley and I gasped, turning to the doorway. Lena's ghost wasn't there. Then, from the entryway came the sound of creaking. Without thinking, I crept towards the lobby, peering around the doorframe. My heart stopped when I saw the basement door slightly ajar, a door I had never seen open in all my years at Macy Manor. And through the gap, in the darkness, there glowed a pair of familiar blue eyes. But they weren't translucent. "Lena!" I screamed, elated, even more so than when we first reunited. "Artie," Riley began, her voice laced with fear as I rushed toward the door. I barely heard her. I didn't hear anything except those eyes. I reached for the door handle, and as I threw it open, Lena's eyes vanished into the shadows. I followed her. I stumbled down the wooden steps into the dark, forbidden basement. I ignored the strange smell, the stench of something not of this world. Moonlight filtered through an empty window, revealing a black hole in the floor. An old wooden door stood open, as if Ernest had once sealed the dark opening. But I didn't care. The moonlight illuminated Lena. I was floating, or so it seemed, toward her. But as I reached her, something terrible began to surface. A feeling, something I couldn't explain. Terror. A warmth filled my mouth, a strange warmth that threatened to break my defenses. When I opened my eyes, I screamed. The blackness had swallowed Lena's blue eyes, leaving only a hollow, ravenous black. Her hands dug into my arms, preventing my escape. She began pulling me backward, back toward the hole. The plea of two had never meant to bring Lena back. It had summoned something else. I heard footsteps descending and saw Riley in the reflection of those black eyes, rushing toward me, only to be flung against the wall. I felt my trainers slip into the darkness, a cold beyond coldness gripping me. I closed my eyes, praying for an end. But as I fell, the grip on my body loosened. I opened my eyes and saw something horridly beautiful. White hands, pulling the false Lena into the darkness, exposing the true Lena behind her. Her eyes locked with mine, tears in her eyes. "I love you," she mouthed, just before she vanished. The trapdoor slammed shut. Since then, the grief has been even worse. I sit in the front room, staring at the faces of the Macy family. But there is only one I long to see. If she doesn't return soon, I'll find a way to bring her back.